stories from the book of Acts, which really is the story of the growth of the early church and how the Spirit works through the disciples and those early apostles to share the message of Christ with the wider world. So last week we heard a story about Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples, and this week we turn our attention to Saul, or Paul. Saul was a Pharisee, or Paul was a Pharisee, who initially basically hurt Christians, sort of spoke against them, and basically tried to upend their message, and then had an encounter with the risen Christ that transformed him, and he became one of the most important apostles and early followers in the church, and was renamed from Saul to Paul. And so today we hear the beginning of Paul's mission and ministry in the church, in the wider church, and we'll hear more about Paul in the coming weeks because we'll start to read his letters that he wrote to those early churches and begin to understand some of his thinking. But today we're going to see what happens when he starts to go out with others in the wider world, and how sometimes the messages are received well and other times not, and what happens along the way. And in all of these stories from Acts, it's really about how that Spirit is shaping the disciples and how they're learning just what it means to share this message with the wider world. So let us listen together for the Word of God.
A reading from the book of Acts. Now in the church at Antioch there were prophets and teachers: Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a member of the court of Herod the ruler, and Saul. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work for which I have called them." Then, after fasting and praying, they laid their hands on them and sent them off. In Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet and had never walked, for he had been crippled from birth. He listened to Paul as he was speaking, and Paul, looking at him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And the man sprang up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form!" Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates. He and the crowds wanted to offer sacrifice. When the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We are mortals just like you, and we bring the good news, that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the earth, heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations, God allowed all the nations to follow their own ways, yet God has not left without a witness in doing good, giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, and filling you with food and your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Oh, gracious God, open up our eyes to new ways of seeing you today, our ears to new ways of hearing your voice, our hearts to feel you with us, and our feet to follow in your way. Amen. Have you ever had one of those experiences where you sort of thought the world was one way, only to discover that it was actually another way indeed? Maybe through an encounter or an experience or a conversation where someone opened up your worldview and you suddenly saw things much broader than before. Anybody ever had that happen? This has happened to me over and over again in my life. And one of the earliest times I remember was actually in 9th grade biology class. We were learning about the rods and cones that are in your eye. And cones, some of you may know, are what allow us to see color. We have millions of them in our eye, but there's actually only 3 different kinds. There's red, green, and blue, I think it is, that helps us see the spectrum of color that we know is the rainbow. So my teacher was telling us about this, and I was like, oh, this is kind of cool to learn about. Well, all of a sudden, the teacher dropped this little nugget that apparently there is a shrimp out there with 14 different cones in its eye. In other words, it sees, my teacher said, probably more colors than we even know exist or that we can see with our eye. And I remember just being like, wait, what? Like there's more colors than what we know about? And my teacher said, yeah, we don't know. We can't see through the shrimp's eye, obviously, but we think that they can see all these different colors. And I remember just feeling like, how is this possible? How are there colors that I don't even know exist? And it was this example of how what we know is usually just what we've experienced, or what we're assured of is usually what we've perceived. And when we get new information, the first thing that we try to do is put it into the box, into the framework that we already know. So of course there's only going to be 6 colors that a shrimp can see, but instead, when we get this new information, what we need in order to change our worldview is somebody to challenge us, is an openness of our own heart or soul, and then just a willingness to try to understand a different point of view. And as I read the scripture this morning, which is kind of it's a weird one, it's not one I've ever really spent a lot of time with, what I noticed was that the Spirit, really in the role of this early church, the Spirit's job is really to challenge the worldviews of those early believers, and the Spirit to challenge through the disciples and the apostles the worldviews of the people around them. And I was thinking, this is still the role of the Spirit today, to really challenge us, to broaden out our worldviews, and also to help us broaden out the worldviews of the people around us. And I think this is actually one of the great gifts that as a progressive church we give to the world, because we believe in a God that is still speaking, a God that, as one of our Puritan ancestors said, where there is yet more light and truth to break forth from God's word. And so that part of our role as Easter people is to both be open to and help others expand their worldview. And in this text, there are at least 3 examples of how the Spirit does this. And I want to just touch on all 3, just so that it helps us think about how the Spirit might be working in and through us in this time in our lives. So the first is at the very beginning, when we get this little piece from chapter 13 about the church in Antioch and all the people who are there. If you were here last week, you heard us read a story from Acts chapter 10 about Peter. And Peter was a right-hand disciple of Jesus. Early on, all the apostles were going early on to synagogues, teaching the message to the Jewish people. And Peter gets this vision that says the message is actually much broader. It's for everybody. It's for all the non-Jewish or Gentile people. And so last week we talked about that, about who might we need to be expanded? How might our vision need to be expanded? And by the time we get 3 chapters later, the church has blown up into Gentile territory. And where we are this morning is in Antioch. It's even outside of Israel in modern-day Syria. And the people that are there are just a hodgepodge of people. There's Barnabas, who's a Levite from the Jewish tribe. There's Simeon, it says of Niger, which is a way of saying a black person is there, Niger meaning black. There is Lucius of Cyrene, which is from North Africa. There's someone who's from the court of Herod, so somebody that was from the Roman king's court. And then, of course, there's Saul, who was later named Paul, but the Pharisee who has basically been criticizing and punishing the Christians before he became a convert. And so it's just this wide swath of ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity that is just breaking open those views of the early church about who's in and who's out. And the question that, as I said, that we wrestled with last week is, how is the Spirit inviting us to expand our world view today about who's in and who's out? And as a church, we've done a lot of thinking about this and on large-scale things like with immigration and LGBT rights, especially thinking about transgender folks. But also, as we were talking in our small group last week, for some of us, the growing edge is just people in our own families who think differently than we do, or neighbors on a different political side. And so this idea that the Spirit is working in us still to expand our worldview and help us see more of the diversity in God's realm. So that's one of the ways that the Spirit expands our worldview in the text. A second one that shows up in this text is actually in that little healing story. When Paul goes up to Lystra, which is in modern-day Turkey, so he's going around the Mediterranean, and he comes to this town where he meets a man who is crippled from birth. And this is significant in a number of ways, but one of them was that at that time, if you had a physical deformity like that, it not only meant that you were, that people saw something wrong with you physically, but people saw something wrong with you socially. You were pushed out to the margins, because the idea was that you had probably done something wrong, or your parents had done something wrong that made you born that way. And so you can imagine this man who's there, who's been crippled since birth, having this narrative or this worldview of being told since he was little, he's not good enough, he's not well, he's not included in the community, he's not part of us. And that was probably also the narrative or the worldview of the community around him. He's different. We don't want to be around him. And so one of the things that's so beautiful about this story is that the Spirit comes through Paul, and as he's visiting, it says he sees the man. He looks intently at him. And this is consistent with what Jesus did in his healings all along, that he would come to a place and he would see somebody, usually on the margins, but see somebody for who they really were, looked at them intently, and saw the whole person, not just whatever ability or disability was there, but saw the whole person. And in this case, Paul says, sees him and sees his faith and sees his desire for wholeness and connection, and heals him. And not only the story heals him physically, but more importantly, heals him socially, changes his worldview, restores him to community, so that his narrative can change from I don't belong, or I'm not worthy, or I'm not well, to I am part of this community. I am loved by God. I am worthy. And it just makes me wonder about how many of us have these kinds of narratives running in our own lives. Narratives that may have been running there since we were born, or we picked up along the way. Narratives of not being good enough. Narratives of having to be successful. Narratives of people will leave if we don't do X, Y, or Z. Or maybe if we don't have these narratives ourselves, we know people who do. And so the question becomes, how does the Spirit want to move in us to change our worldviews, to change the narratives that we carry about ourselves, or to help us change the narratives that other folks carry? I think about this in my own life from another one of those kind of worldview-changing conversations that I had in my 20s. Some of you know I grew up in the Episcopal Church, but then spent about 10 years in the Evangelical Church, ages 15 to 25, which was also the time when I was coming out. And for me, at that time, those two things were incompatible. Faith and sexuality were incompatible. And I remember as I sort of confided in a few people about where I was, they listened, but they all agreed, yes, that's incompatible, and you're going to have to figure out what to do about that. But I finally saw this counselor who was the first person who really said to me in a way that I could hear. She just said, well, maybe it is possible for you to be gay and Christian. And I remember thinking, like, wait, what? That doesn't make sense to me. That's not my worldview. I don't know what you're talking about. And she said, well, just sit with it. There are people who've done it. You can do it. And there are ways that you can put these two pieces back together. And it took that challenge, and it took about 5 or almost 10 years then of really hard wrestling for me to finally get those things put together. But I needed somebody to challenge that view, and I think about the Spirit working in her to help me. what's so interesting is that that conversation was 20 years ago now. And what blows me away is how we still, as a church, will go to the Pride Parade in downtown Portland, or we staff a booth there. And every year when we sit there, invariably, there's somebody who comes up and says, wow, there are churches where you can be gay and Christian. There are churches that would welcome me. And we say yes. And it's changing the worldview of folks who come up to that booth just by sharing the message that we already have. And so it just strikes me that the Spirit longs to change both those narratives that we have for ourselves and the narratives that so many other people carry. So that's the second way that the Spirit works. And this, both this idea of who belongs and who's included, but then also what are the stories that we carry about ourselves and the worldviews we have that the Spirit might want to change. So the third and final way that I see the Spirit working in this passage is also what happens immediately after the healing story. So they're in Lystra, which is really a Greco-Roman town. There's not, the worldview there is, think back to Greek mythology, the pantheon of gods, right? It's Zeus and Hermes and Athena and all these other folks. And so when they witness this healing, the people there put it in the box that they know. These must be the Greek gods come on earth to do something good. Sometimes they do something bad, but we better appease these gods. And as it's told, it's actually a really kind of funny story because Paul and Barnabas have no idea what's going on. They just see the people getting ready for a giant party, and they assume, like, wow, these people must be really excited about this healing. This is great. Until the priest from the Zeus temple comes down the road with oxen and flowers, and they suddenly realize, wait a second, they're sacrificing to us. They think we're the gods. And so they immediately have to go into this reframing time of, wait, no, we're just mortals. This is the power of God, yes, but not the gods that you think. This is the power of the living God. And then they go on to basically say, this is a God you already know. It's a God that is in nature. It's the God that created the heavens and the earth. It's the God that gave you rains for your crops. It's the God that puts joy in your heart. This is someone you already know. And basically what they do is they meet the people where they are. It's kind of the earliest, wherever you are on life's journey, you're welcome here. They meet the people in what they know, and then they start from there to reframe it a little bit and to tell them, instead it's about this other God, this living God, this Hebrew God. And as they go on to tell, we don't really hear the rest of the story, but it doesn't go so well for them. There are some people that believe, there are some people that don't, and then there's some people that eventually run them out of town, actually. But when Paul and Barnabas come back later, there is a church there that's growing and thriving. And so some of those seeds took root while they're there. And it's a reminder that sometimes when we're out there trying to reframe the conversation or share our faith, it's not always well received. And sometimes it takes a little persistence and a little trying to do that. And as I was thinking about this and trying to think of examples around this one, I kept coming back to the conversations we've been having around privilege, both within our community, but then in our church community, but then also outside of these doors, and how we've been doing a lot of work around our white privilege, around citizenship privilege, and things like this. And part of that, we can see all the blessings of our lives, and we see the power that we have and the wealth that we have and things like this, but then we attribute it maybe to the wrong things. We sort of think it's because of our good work, which sometimes it is, our hard work. It's because of our entitlement, and we deserve this because we've done well for ourselves. And part of the reframing comes when we go back and say, yes, there are blessings there, but did they really come from those things? Or did they come from other things? Did they come from unjust systems and unjust policies? Do they come from born on the backs of people of color? And so we start with what we can see, but then we attribute it in a different way and reframe the conversation in a different way, which is hard for us both to do ourselves and hard sometimes out in the world because it's obviously not always well received. And yet it's a conversation that we're called to have, a reframing that the Spirit asks of us. So as I read this text and think about it, I just think about how the Spirit in the early church really was about sending people out, reframing the minds of both the apostles, but then also using them to reframe the mindset of the people around them. Sharing that message of love and of justice and of peace, but in a way that was always expanding and always growing. And we're still in that today. Still learning, still growing, still letting the Spirit guide us and lead us as we seek to just see the variety and the diversity of the colors and the kingdom of God. Paul wrote in another of his letters in Corinthians, he said, now we see through a mirror darkly, but one day we will see face to face. Now we know only in part, but one day we will know in full, even as we are fully known. And so we are on that journey. We only see some of the colors now. We only see some of the spectrum now. But with the Spirit's help, we are growing. And we are helping our world to grow in vision, in love, in justice, and in healing. So may the Spirit continue to be with us and guide us.